go ahead and kick us off. I hope others will go ahead and follow suit as they join in and type in their name and organization and where they're coming in from. Welcome to the third webinar in this series. The series is called Student Support, Powered by Artificial and Human Intelligence. And the third webinar in our series is about generating powerful college and career advising content. And we will talk about tech-enabled solutions and how chatbots can be used throughout that process today. Just really delighted to have the next hour and a half to focus on this really important topic. So I'll introduce myself. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Karen Zaribi. I am the founder of Shift. Shift has the pleasure of facilitating the hybrid advising co-op along with our technical partner, Mainstay. And I'd like to thank and recognize, before we go anywhere on today's call, the 5 organizations that participate in this co-op: Bottom Line, College Advising Corps, KIP, Let's Get Ready, and One Goal. I think you'll see today that they are transparently and very generously sharing their knowledge for the benefit of the greater good. And it's been really wonderful to be a part of this co-op with such generous and wonderful education leaders. Thank you. A huge thank you to them, the presenters today, as well as their organizations. And this work is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Pathways team. I'll say a little bit more about that later. And we have our program officer who has a very active role on these calls, who I'll introduce in just a moment. The Hybrid Advising Co-op brings these 5 organizations together, like I mentioned before, and each of these organizations is testing different iterations of their model and sharing information with each other, including data, seamlessly. As part of this work, we have agreed to create some public goods that will benefit the larger field. And so these webinars are part of that dissemination effort. We will also be producing a playbook. We are producing a playbook that's going to be ready next month, actually. And so since you are on our mailing list, you'll be getting that playbook and information about that playbook as well. So from last week's or last month's call, we asked in the poll, we took a poll to learn about where different organizations were with the use of AI, specifically for advising supports. And it was really interesting to see the results. So there's a real split here. You know, most with kind of none, and my guess would be kind of ideating or thinking about the use of different tech-enabled solutions, or curious. And then others kind of actively exploring, experimenting and piloting, and then some out in the implementation phase. So I share this knowing that we are all going to be in different places with our learning and our journey with the use of AI. And I want to invite you to please contribute. So if you're someone who maybe has a lot of experience with this, please contribute your experiences. We'd love to hear from you. Type in the chat. We'll also have ways to kind of elevate some of the comments and chats, so we make sure that as we get into the Q&A session that there's opportunity to hear from folks. And also, if you're kind of in a contemplative state and thinking about this, I really invite you to ask a lot of questions, because you have amazing experts here today who have been doing this work for a while and are generously sharing their learning. So one of the topics that we have been hitting on in each of these calls is there's really no one right model there's no one size fits all for hybrid advising. And in fact, each of the 5 organizations that are participating in the hybrid advising co-op have very different models from each other. What is in common is that they're each using Mainstay and as a technical partner, and they're using AI to some capacity, but it's all very different how they organize their work. And in fact, today, when you hear from our speakers from Let's Get Ready and Bottom Line, they'll be contrasting a couple of areas in their model. So this is very interesting. So we keep sharing this in the spirit of there's no right way or no one way to do this. And if you didn't get to hear our earlier calls, we encourage you to go back and listen to calls number 1 and 2, because we also hit on this topic quite a bit in those calls as well. So before we get started, I want to ground us in the importance of this work and why a lot of organizations are seeking to use technology to try to reach more students, because college and career advising is important. Now, I know I'm saying this to people who do this work every day and are very convinced. However, I think bringing in the voice of Andrea Rascon from KIP, an alumni success advisor, will help kind of ground us for our conversation today. So really hoping the technology works and that we can hear Andrea's story before we get started.
My name is Andrea, and like many of the students we serve, I am a first-generation college graduate. I somehow made it through my education while being tossed around a system that was not built for people like me. But with the support of people like yourselves, I was able to put myself on a path to break generational barriers. In my first year as an undergrad, I remember feeling like, I don't know if I could do this. Why is this so hard? Maybe I should just go home. I felt very much isolated and alone on a predominantly white campus. It wasn't until I accidentally stumbled into a student support office that I met my new advisors and I found a home. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. They saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. This was a true shift in my motivation to keep going, as they helped me envision a bright future for myself, become grounded in my values, and find my voice.
So I think as Andrea inspires us here, how important this college and career advising is, and reaching more students has a potential huge upside. She recorded that video for us, or that Ignite talk for us, for a recent convening. And we didn't show the whole thing today, just given the virtual format. It might be hard to see the whole thing, but we will be sending it out with the notes. So you can listen to her whole talk when you receive the notes if you would like. So for our conversation today, we will going to what I call a fishbowl, or many of us call a fishbowl conversation, where we will be hearing a conversation between three experts in generating powerful and culturally relevant and responsive college and career advising content. That fishbowl is going to focus on three main themes. The first is organizing the work, how each organization has organized the work. And this will get into some of the things I was talking to before about different models, the types of content and proactive versus reactive content. And then how each organization assures high quality of content with different roles for technology and the chatbot. Maurice McCulley, who I'll introduce in just a moment, will be kind of coming in and out of the fishbowl at times to ask questions or elevate things that are coming up in the chat. And he will also lead us through a Q&A session at the end. And then we'll just wrap up at the end, sharing a little bit about our last call in this series, as well as some of the public materials that will be available soon. So it's my pleasure to introduce our contributors, moderators, speakers. My co-moderator and facilitator throughout the series is Maurice McCulley. He is our program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with the Pathways team. Maurice is also a subject matter expert. He had worked in piloting and launching a hybrid advising program prior to joining the Gates Foundation. So this has been a wonderful project to work along with him and learn from his expertise in this area. And our panelists today are Grace Bianchardi, Chief Program Officer for Let's Get Ready. And Grace, before Grace's career began at Let's Get Ready, Grace was a high school and elementary school teacher. And Grace also served in leadership roles at Citizen Schools and Peace First. And Grace has been a very passionate leader in the hybrid advising co-op as well, sharing a lot of really critical information about how this tech works as a kind of an early adopter in this space. Next, I'll introduce Sarah Place, who is also Chief Program Officer at Bottom Line. Sarah began her career at Bottom Line as an advisor, and she worked with Bottom Line as Bottom Line grew, and took on different leadership roles on different projects until 2012, joined the national team. And we've just been delighted to have Bottom Line as part of this community, and Sarah and her team as well, learning from them throughout the way. And then last and certainly not least, Julie Delich, who is from Mainstay, and is a very unique background. I was really interested to learn that she is a licensed mental health therapist, but also has worked a lot in educational leadership. So she's really uniquely poised to be working in this space about developing emotionally intelligent and culturally responsive content to support students. And Julie will be moderating the fishbowl conversation as well as sharing her own expertise kind of throughout the way. So just want to say a huge thank you to each of our panelists for not just sharing their expertise, but also all of the work that goes into preparing for these calls. So thank you so much for your time. We know you're very busy. So as we go into this fishbowl, wanted to put together these 3 themes that our speakers will touch upon: organizational structure, the proactive and responsive content, and assuring high quality content. And with that kind of goes training and the different organizational processes to assure content. But a number of words that came up as we were looking at the content for today. So powerful, emotionally intelligent, responsive, culturally relevant. These were all of the adjectives that were used to describe good college and career advising content. So that is a theme that's going to be woven kind of throughout each of these main topics. So you'll hear the speakers kind of talk about how they assure these different attributes of their content as they start to use more tech-enabled strategies. So with this, I will hand over to Julie from Mainstay to kick us off.
Thank you so much. So let's go ahead and jump into what we've learned. When we were talking about preparing for this session, all 3 of us agreed that we wanted this to leave each of you with something practical and tangible, that you could really understand what we're learning as it's happening in action, not really from that higher theoretical level, but really, how does this work? So here are some of the things we're seeing so far before we kind of jump into the fishbowl. One of the things that we're noticing is the importance of creating a centralized strategy for your conversation design and your communication. We see so many times that institutions use a department by a department approach to communicating, and that can be very confusing for the learners and students. So it's really important to have that centralized strategy that has a cohesive tone and messaging, thoughtful structure. The other thing we're seeing a lot of is that we want to meet students where they actually are. And as much as we all love email, our students are on their phones. And so text messaging is a much more effective way to reach a student. It has much higher, exponentially higher open rates and read rates compared to emails. So all the content we're going to be talking about today is delivered via text message or a human contact. My favorite thing, and we're going to dig much more into this as we swim around the fishbowl, is proactively engaging learners and not just waiting for them to reach out to us. So many of our students don't know what they don't know. And so it's really important that we're giving them guidance and giving them proactive tips before they even realize they have a question. Not to mention how much that reduces stress, and that emotional intelligence, mental health background bias is going to come out. So thanks for warning everybody about that, Karen. And then the last thing I'll mention here before we start the conversation is that nudges alone are not effective. There's plenty of research that shares that. And as much as we might think that, oh, if I just remind someone to do their FAFSA, they'll do it, it actually only really works when it's in the context of a caring relationship. So it's important to infuse emotionally intelligent, socially emotional messaging throughout your communication plan to really create that trusted relationship in the communication strategy. So let's dive in and swim around in our fishbowl in the next slide here. Pardon me. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we dive into the fishbowl, I wanted to make one more research comment. So Mainstay is really invested in a lot of research, and one of our most recent projects was with this incredible group here, the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, the Partnership for Education Advancement, and Norfolk State University. And this isn't published yet, so this is a sneak peek into the findings. The study's wrapped, but it's not out yet. But what we did is we had the Yale team and students from Norfolk State and a cultural responsiveness expert review all of our messaging. And then we tested the revised content to see if there would be a year-over-year increase in engagement. And while it was small, there was a statistically significant improvement in the engagement rates. And now stats can be misleading. What I really want to hammer home with this is there were 7,000 more HBCU students engaging with our content as a result of increasing the cultural relevance and the emotional intelligence. 7,000 people's lives were impacted in a positive way by these changes. So it's really powerful to be thinking about your content in a deep and meaningful way. And that's exactly what my colleagues are going to be talking about in a moment. So let's move on to that next slide and really now start to think about how can we dig into this conversation. So I know, Grace and Sarah, that you both work with Mainstay and you share that engagement platform, but you both use it very differently. So let's start off. Tell us about the structure that you utilize to organize your work.
Thanks, Julie. And thanks so much, everyone, for being here. I'm really excited for this conversation. I can jump in and share a bit about how Bottom Line structures our approach to this work. And one thing that I think is important to point out, too, is so our virtual advising program we call Blueprint. Blueprint is actually a pilot for the organization. So you may hear me refer to our core program, which is the program that we have been operating since our inception in 1997, which is a much more intensive in-person model. Our Blueprint program is a hybrid program where we are really focused on reaching students that wouldn't ordinarily be able to participate in our core program and really seeing if we can reach scale by reaching more students in a lighter touch model. We think about the model sort of in a both proactive and responsive format, and we have the bot enabled in our program. So we have a bot that we call Blue, and we also have a team of virtual advisors, and we are supporting students with wraparound supports between both the bot and the advisors. So when we think about the proactive approach, our thinking there is really taking our curriculum from our core model and seeing how can we implement that in a lighter touch model through campaigns, through nudges, through reminders, that the bot is then able to respond to in terms of when we get those responses from students. So we build our curriculum around our DEAL model. Our DEAL model is, it stands for degree, employability, affordability, and life. And those are really the 4 pillars that we are designing this curriculum around. That curriculum is going out in the form of text messages to our students that they're getting on their phone. They happen about once a week. We have someone on our team who is in charge of really creating the content calendar for the year, and they're working really closely with the rest of our team to ensure that folks are able to give feedback on that messaging, to ensure that we're using the right modality in terms of what gets sent out versus for text messages versus potentially emails. And I think the really important thing here too is that we always want to keep our advisors in the loop of what's going out, so they know how to plan their time. They know exactly what the messages are that are going out, so they can be prepared to support students. Yeah, and then on the responsive side, you'll see in a second sort of the diagram of how we structure the program and the response. But our bot Blue is it is a bot first program, a bot forward program. So when the bot is pushing messages out, the bot is also the first to respond to the students. Our advisors are there to support students when the bot is not able to answer a question or when it's clear that the student needs human intervention. the logic there is that we are trying to, as we build for scale, really trying to think about how can the bot be most useful as essentially like a virtual assistant. So is the bot able to answer some of the questions that are, potentially a student could, not necessarily just, Googleable answers, but some of those lower hanging fruit questions, almost like an FAQ style question and answer. Whereas that really does free up our humans, our advisors, to be able to support with higher value, more complex challenges that a student might be able to face. That is my bottom line summary. Grace, I'll kick it to you.
Awesome. So Let's Get Ready is a virtual near-peer coaching organization, right? Powered by college students, supporting students from high school through college. And for the past 10 years, we've been using text messaging to sort of augment and to support students and support coaching virtually. In part because our students, they all have a phone in their pocket. And increasingly through the co-op and through our own kind of pilots have been testing sort of the role of AI and the chatbot in our work. Ultimately, for Let's Get Ready, we've decided that the chatbot's really helpful on the back end, but we don't actually want it interacting with our students. And so for us, as a near-peer mentorship program, it's all about getting students in direct contact with their coach. That's what we call an advisor. So I'll probably switch back and forth between coaches and advisors. And as a program that's operating at scale, we've got about 18,000 students who are kind of in our hybrid approach. We really need a robust outbound text curriculum that feels like it's coming from our coaches and that kickstarts great conversations between coaches and students. We need that in order to be able to sort of deliver at scale. And so the idea of our proactive curriculum is it's all about sort of like kicking that off. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, I think the visual might be helpful. So this is sort of like side by side, bottom line, and Let's Get Ready. In our model, our students are receiving kind of a weekly text. It's really differentiated. So if you're a junior in high school, you're receiving really different content, as you'd imagine, from a junior in college. Students receive that on their phone. And then in the Let's Get Ready model, the responses are coming into an inbox, a coach inbox, and then that coach responds. The AI is kind of working in the background, but unlike what Sarah described in terms of bottom line, our chatbot is not interacting directly with our students. Coaches respond. So in terms of like developing that outbound, that proactive curriculum, we have one full-time staff member who writes and tests that outbound curriculum. At first, it was about 50% of their time. Now it's their full-time role. And similar, Sarah, to what you said, it's all about sort of extracting what we know like would be happening in a really robust in-person advising session and somehow sort of like distilling that down into a couple texts a week that are really high impact. And they're writing at this point, like I think almost 6 different curricula. So depending on the phase, depending on where students are in their path to college or what institution they're in, they're differentiating that outbound curriculum. And the one last thing I would say, and Julie, this hits on something that you said, that staff member for us is like the gatekeeper. So no texts are going out to our students from any department at Let's Get Ready. So if there's a great career event or a cool funder, opportunity to meet some of our funders, all of that is coming through that like one curriculum person so that voice stays consistent sort of all across. And then, as I mentioned, our coaches are the ones who are responding to every message that comes in. So there's a lot of training that goes into making sure that they're ready to do that and that they can do that at scale. But we're able to do that with coaches having about 1,500 students on their caseloads at about 10 hours a week. So this proactive curriculum goes out and not all students respond. And then the coaches respond to the students who reply back.
I love seeing how differently you both use the same technology and yet still obtain incredible outcomes for your students. It's a great case study for all of us to look at it, how differently you can use the technology and still really make a difference for people. I think, Grace, it was you that said that the brain, the AI is on, but the mouth is turned off. Was that you that brought that up? I love that analogy, right? That the brain is on in both of these examples, but the mouth is only on for one side, and the other side, it's a human that does the talking back. So I wanted to bring that up because I thought it was a great way that you explained it. Let's go ahead and continue forward with some more slides. So let's move to the next one. And this is my absolute favorite topic. I will try not to go on a soapbox before we talk about it, but I did want to share one data point. So I was looking at all of our messaging from 2023 at Mainstay. So this is about 200 plus partners that we work with across the entire year of 2023. And of the incoming messages, 70% of the incoming messages from students were responding to a proactive message that our partners sent. They were not spontaneous questions or spontaneous comments. 70% of the time students engaged with us were in response to us. And I think that's a really powerful thing to be aware of. It surprised me as well, but it really emphasizes the importance of thinking about what Grace and Sarah were talking about that planful approach that you all use. So let's dive into a question here on the next slide. I would love for both of you to talk about what are some of the biggest things that you're thinking about when you're developing your proactive outreach to drive the model that you have in place.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick us off. Julie, to your point, like that outbound, that proactive curriculum is like really at the heart. I mean, lots of our students don't reply back, right? They tell us at the end of the year, I got all your messages, they were super helpful, but I'm sorry, I never replied back, right? So lots of students are just listening, but they're not actually replying back. But from my perspective, we want to optimize that proactive curriculum as best as we possibly can to try to encourage response back, right? Because the more engaging, the more relevant, the more useful the content is, it means that a student who might need help is more likely to reply back. And then now that human on the other end is primed and ready to go to support. So some of the ways that we optimize that proactive curriculum, one is to make sure that the text messages are useful, and that they stand alone in their usefulness, knowing that only a small percentage of students are going to reply back. So like, I'm sure lots of people in this virtual room are like, advising experts and know that there's a lot you'd want to try to pack in. You don't want to pack it in, right? From our experience, you really want to sort of pick what is most critical, what connects to a milestone that's most critical for persistence or enrollment or whatever your outcomes are. A second thing we try to do to sort of make sure that that proactive curriculum is optimized is to use different kinds of questions to gather data back from students that we can then use to drive, very targeted advising and curriculum differentiation moving forward. So one of the things that's cool about the platform that we use is that we can auto save information that comes back from students. So if a student says they're all set with the FAFSA, we're not going to send them those like 3 next messages that we have queued up to like nudge kids to work on the FAFSA, because they've already given us that great information. And so making sure that that proactive curriculum like feels alive in that way for students, so that it's not just sort of hammering them regardless, it's using good data about them to kind of inform what they receive. And that the last thing I would say is just that it's that the curriculum, that we do everything we possibly can to encourage a response. And I know, Sarah, I'm sure over the course of this conversation, you and I will kind of like pull out threads of things that we do to like maximize that engagement. But, from our perspective, the more engaged a student is, the more likely they are to, to follow through on those important tasks and to sort of ultimately reach their goals. We also know that like, no matter how insignificant the response is from a student, even if they just give us a thumbs up for some of that proactive content, that is a hook that our coaches can then like pick up and be like, oh, I'm so glad that you're all set with that thing. Like, how about this other thing? So like building those to be as, as encouraging of response as possible. So emojis and give us a 1 to 10, or like, feel free to complain, like all those different types of invitation for engagement are like really critical to that proactive content working to engage students. And if you wouldn't mind switching to the next slide, I pulled some examples. And let's see if I can like see these at the same time. So I just shared a couple of those best practices that we use to kind of reach, really strong and effective proactive content and proactive outreach. On the left-hand side, you'll see a couple examples of messages that went out in March to college students from Let's Get Ready's kind of central curriculum. And on the right are messages that went out to our high school seniors, a couple of the messages in March. And you'll see, I won't call out all of them, but you'll see some of those features that I just discussed. So up at the top left, the like, hey, Kalia message, right? That's personalized. It's incorporating a little bit of information about the coach, even though that's centrally written, right? So our curriculum writer kind of got that answer from each of the coaches and incorporated that into that centrally sent outbound message. And it really builds that trust, and it makes it more likely that a student's going to engage back. You'll see like modeling self-care and generosity, like different types of questions. Like there's open-ended questions on the left versus on the right, like, give us an emoji kind of prompts. You'll see like that variety of prompts. Even if a student sends back one little emoji, right, it like can kick off a whole conversation. You'll see different things like norming the challenge. Like, we know this is hard. You'll see on the far right, like we all know, supporting students around the FAFSA right now is a whole thing, but you'll see like how we try to distill that down into like some pretty simple, clean directives and a link for more information, and then a 1 through 10 response. This is just a couple examples from March of how we organize that curriculum to make sure that it maximizes student response.
Yeah, excellent point. And thank you for specific examples. I think it's really helpful to look at the way you're framing things. I love your use of emojis. And I like that most of them are actually in the context of the message. That helps with deliverability rates, as just a little side tip for everybody, to keep the emojis inside the content as opposed to at the front or the end. So with all of that kind of great information, let's go to the next slide and really keep talking about the way we're organizing content here. So while we know that the proactive content is really the key to being successful with engagement, we still have to be mindful and ready for engaging with our students when they do ask a question, so that we can be responsive to our students. So how do you use responsive content?
Thanks. I'm happy to jump in here. So I think pieces on responsive really are thinking about, when you get that response from the student, what do you do with it? So when you have the bot mouth turned on the way that we do, for us, it's really, really important to know that we are positioning students to be able to get the best possible response from the bot. So a lot of quality control has to go into that. So because our bot Blue is the first one to respond, we have a lot of quality control methods built in place where we really want to make sure that the responses coming in are appropriate, that they're matched, and the advisors are watching to make sure that an advisor response isn't needed, and if it is, that they're quick to jump in there. The pieces I would point to, I think, for our overall response or our overall approach here is really thinking about who is delivering the message when it comes to that response piece. So that's the piece where I think when we're looking at those responses, really trying to understand, when an advisor response does need to jump in, and then how we're able to match that, and really make sure that the knowledge base is supporting that over time. The knowledge base, I think, is a really important thing to point out here. One of the reasons that we chose Mainstay as a partner was because of the model around the existing knowledge base and the bot already built in. We had to do a fair amount of work just to make sure that we were really updating the knowledge base to reflect the voice of Bottom Line. We wanted to make sure that the bot sounded as much like a bottom line advisor as possible, where they were giving, accurate responses. And that takes time to really make sure that you are building in your voice, that the voice is aligned to the values of your organization, and that it's accurate. So there's a fair amount of work that has to go on over time where you're, updating the knowledge base on more timely maintenance issues, and then also really thinking about, are there bigger projects you have to undertake when it comes to really making sure that knowledge base is up to date. Another piece that I think, I want to make sure I'm on the right slide here.
If you want to, we can jump to
I
talking
think
about
it's the seamless one is, I think, the one I was going to go into next.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's go to the next slide. So I love the way you framed this up of like the brain, the knowledge base being so important to keep updating. So please keep going with how you would make this seamless for students.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so I think when we think about a seamless experience for students, we really want to ground ourselves in like the empathetic mindset of what would a student really want to experience when it comes to this hybrid advising program. Julia, I love how you pointed out in the beginning that texting alone doesn't work. So I think a lot of the students are really excited about, getting messages, engaging with a bot. There's a lot of students too that really want that human interaction. And the nice thing about virtual or the hybrid advising approach is that they can get both. So when we think about the seamless student experience, there's a couple things I would point out. One is I think you really have to be careful about who is actually delivering that message. So there are things that Blue is really well positioned to be able to answer, and there are things that make a lot of sense for us to send out as reminders coming from Blue. There are also some things, Grace had mentioned, you really want to reduce opt-outs and keep students as engaged as possible, because if they're engaged, they're going to be receiving the programming and they're more likely to persist and ultimately graduate. So with that in mind, we have really important discussions on our team about, we want to send this message out. Is this appropriate to send out in a text message? We've already sent a message this week. Maybe we can send this via email, or advisors can be talking about this when they do office hours with students. An important example to point out here is that we do pre and post surveys every year to gauge student satisfaction, really trying to understand where we're having the most impact, what students would like to be able to see in the programming. So we're taking recommendations and feedback because that's really important to us. But we also know that students often feel over-surveyed. They have that survey fatigue. We made a design choice to send that out via email instead of text message. So I think those are some of the examples of really thinking about like the modality of how you send that out, who is the messenger of that. And then the other piece I would point out is thinking about how you're designing around reducing opt-outs. So one thing that we do is we have a really intentional onboarding process for our students. So we have a digital self-paced course that talks about Blueprint as a program, so students really understand what can they expect. We've also made some changes. I was really excited that the team made some changes this past year about onboarding students to the different tools they can use within the Mainstay platform. So things like #advisor to be able to schedule a meeting with their advisor. So some key shortcuts and tips and things like that, just like how to navigate that texting program. Another thing I would point out is having the integration between Mainstay and our Salesforce system has been really critical. We use what we call a communal caseload at Blueprint, where we don't have individual caseloads for each advisor. Our advisors are serving all the students together. So, a student might be texting one advisor one day and another advisor the other day. And for us, it's really important to keep case notes and understand where did we leave off with that student. So if another advisor has to step in and support that student, they're jumping right in, and that creates less, friction or frustration for the student. And then another thing I wanted to point out is wanting to, we made a very intentional design choice around adding signatures to all of our messages. So anytime our advisors text a student, they put their signature in the text, so the student knows it's a human texting them back. The team did a pretty extensive project of going through the entire knowledge base and adding Blue's signature to our scripts. So when blue is sending out a message, the student knows that it is the bot. I think, you know, where the world of AI and wanting to really build, AI intelligence with our students, and also just building trust within the program. I think it's really important for our students to be able to know, are they texting with a bot or are they texting with a human? So that's been a really helpful design choice for us to really differentiate like who's actually the messenger here. And I actually have an example on the next slide if you want to jump there. So if you can see here, the top is a message where blue had sent out a message. The signature is right there. And then at the bottom, shout out to Sam here on our team. Sam responded to the student, and you can see the difference too of what that human intervention looks like versus the bot message. It's follow-up, it's acknowledging that the student was supposed to do something, and we're not sure if they actually did it because they haven't told us. So I think that's really the persistence of both the bot and the human at play here to really make sure that the student is meeting these critical milestones.
I really appreciate and admire your design choice there. We try at Mainstay to encourage sort of a human-centered, AI-supported approach, and this is a beautiful example of that. Students will form parasocial relationships with the bot. They have a connection to Blue. It's another figure in their life. And while like from my generation, that's not something I would necessarily be quick to do, a lot of our younger learners really have this digital native kind of thinking that they feel comfortable asking questions to a bot. I also really admire that you're very quick to point out when it's a human intervening to not confuse the student and create that seamless experience. This is a beautiful example, in my opinion.
I wanted to jump in and say what I think is really smart about this is that you're not running the risk of breaking down the trust with bottom line and with the advisor if Blue kind of gets it wrong, right? Because like it's a bot, so it's not always going to respond. It might need to ask for clarification. It's not always going to match perfectly to something in the knowledge base. And so by like signing it, you're not risking eroding the overall trust and relationship that students have with you and with your advisors, like by trying to trick the students, right? I think a lot of organizations aren't really sure how to do that. And I just think the signature is really smart.
Yeah, beautifully said. So let's go ahead and continue forward on the next slide with a theme that kind of runs throughout all of our work. I mentioned at the beginning that we've been working on a study with Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence and Partnership for Ed Advancement in Norfolk State. And, I think it's really important to call out the importance of making sure that we are getting feedback and getting feedback from our students to engage. And that was one of the key parts of that study, was feedback directly from students. So I'd love to hear how you think about making sure that your messaging is culturally responsive and relevant when you're building it.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So every part of our model at Let's Get Ready is sort of informed by our culturally responsive mentoring approach. So, every tip sheet that a student has, has gone through that sort of framework around cultural responsiveness. So it's only natural that that text curriculum also mirrors that like level of intentionality. So I can share a couple ways that we do that. So one is that we have a structure in place for vetting the curriculum, like against that. So, if a student's going to get a tip sheet on fit factors, we're thinking about like, does that fit factor tip sheet acknowledge the, the implications of identity in students' decision-making around what schools might be a good fit for them, right? And so that outbound, that proactive curriculum is gonna, it's always gonna link to something that has sort of met that, like that level of rigor around cultural responsiveness. Another thing that I think is really important part of our curriculum, and you saw it in those examples I shared, which is like peer norming, not assuming existing knowledge about how to navigate something. So like not over explaining and not sort of being prescriptive or patronizing, but trying to be more empowering in the messaging. So, showing students what tools they have available, making sure to be clear about how to do something, but trying to balance that tone and make sure that it's not sort of assuming and being overly prescriptive. I mentioned the kind of peer norming, so saying like, listen, a lot of students struggle with this step. Like, here's something you can do about it. Like, you've got this, right? So like really making sure that we're normalizing that there are barriers, that there are bumps along the way, and helping students sort of feel like that is just part of how they're being talked to. I mentioned the like different types of message and different types of questions. One of the reasons we use different, you saw the like, what's, your response 1 to 10, or give me the emoji, or a really open-ended question. Part of that is just because different things work for different students, and our goal is to have them engage so that they can talk to a near peer and get the support that they need. But it's also related to kind of our thoughts around cultural responsivity, and to not make our text messages too demanding and like overly focused on extraction, which I think sometimes nudges really can get over focused. So making sure there's that real balance with like celebration and self-care tips and a question that's really important for us to know, because it helps, Sarah, to your example, like helped drive, the next step of advising that needed to happen. So, being careful not to trigger avoidance by like being careful about how we frame unappealing tasks, right? And like making sure it's not all about extraction. I think another thing we focus on is that kind of, you saw an example of a coach incorporating a coach response, how a coach was thinking about how to prep for something as part of that proactive message, and doing that centrally at scale. So that individual coach wasn't writing that out to 1,500 students. We extracted that from the coach, and then we pushed that out in that central message. And so the students feel like they're in conversation with a human, and like sort of humanizing and building that trust, and creating a vulnerable space with students and a relational space with students, I think has been feedback we've gotten from our students is really important, to kind of acknowledging who they are and inviting them into the space to take advantage of what's here. And I would say feedback. So Julie, you mentioned it, but most of our coaches, the majority of our coaches are former Let's Get Ready students, or have had similar experiences to our students in navigating to and through college. And so making sure we're getting feedback from students, using our student leadership council, like literally having them look at text messages and help us refine our tone, but also having coaches weigh in on that as well. And I just think all of this is good for engagement, and it's good for reducing friction. I think that's a word you use, Sarah, because we don't want students to opt out, and we want them to feel like that this is meaningful information, and that then when they reach a human, that human is also equally prepared to kind of join them in their world in a way that feels, culturally responsive and inclusive.
Yeah, I can jump in and add. I think for us, the approach here is really thinking about the life part of our deal model. So as we create content calendars for the year, really wanting to make sure that we are finding a balance between all areas of deal. So the cultural responsive piece really needs to be woven throughout the entire deal model. Where we are able to go in a little bit deeper is on that life aspect. I will also share, I was we had talked earlier about really wanting to reduce opt-out rates and being very careful about, you can't cram too much into 1 week. My thinking originally before we started this pilot was like, let's just do the most important things, like, did you pay your bill? Did you register for classes? Have you done FAFSA? And I've really come to learn that it's just so critical to add in these life check-ins and really think about like, what is that holistic model. Some of our highest engagement rates for campaigns are coming from some of these life messages that we're sending out, where we invite a student to vent. We ask a student, what is their goal? Where we acknowledge like, hey, you did it, you made it to the end of your first year. There are things like that where we can celebrate milestones, really cheerlead with them. And as Grace mentioned, that often adds another invitation for that student to engage once we receive a response there. The other things I would add, just for from the bottom line perspective, it's really, really important for us to use preferred name for students. So there's some little things like that as you're sending out messages, because we collect legal names. There are things making sure that you're asking about pronouns, anything like that, that you can just make sure that you're being more, sensitive to student experience there. Another thing that I think is a really great model that we've been using is we have a cultural and religious observation calendar that we've been using to pull into some of the campaigns we send out. For example, the team had sent out a message around how to navigate being a college student on campus during Ramadan. So there's some things like that I think are really helpful, just in terms of making sure we, are acknowledging the experiences of all the students we're serving. Bottom line is also really lucky to have some funding around care packages and emergency funding. So when we think about the hybrid approach, for us, that's really been an exciting way to bring aspects of our core model into the Blueprint program. Being able to send out a care package or be able to respond to a student who needs some of that emergency funding. It's also been a really interesting way for us to gauge engagement, in addition to just students texting back. Like we have been seeing that, students will click on a bit.ly link, or they will respond to a survey or things like that. So it's just been helping us really get a bigger picture understanding of how students are able to engage.
Awesome. That's actually a really great segue to this final theme that we want to talk about. So let's wrap up our discussion with talking about how we assure high quality content. I mentioned earlier some research mainstays a part of. We're really committed to doing very robust randomized controlled trials. And through that information, we can really refine our content suggestions for partners. We talked a little bit about kind of using some of those behavioral economics strategies like social norming. We also use emotional intelligence strategies like emotions matter mindset, growth mindset strategies. And I know everybody on this call is probably well versed in those areas. But let's go ahead and go to the next slide to dig into our final kind of discussion topic here of how do you ensure that your content is effective?
I'm happy to jump in here. So I think the really exciting thing about approaching this work as a pilot has really allowed us to deploy a lot of innovation techniques and experiment with things. So it's been exciting working with Shift and the Block Collaborative, because we learn from a lot of other folks in terms of what they're testing and what they're doing. So we've been able to, do some shorter cycle PDSA sprints in terms of like being able to test, like let's do an A/B test and send similar but different message about paying your bill, and see if we can understand the differences between those two different campaigns. So for us, really the motivating factor is, can we do better than we did before, and see an increase in the KPIs that we want to track, whether it's engagement or FAFSA completion, things like that. So we did come up with a set of KPIs that we are holding ourselves accountable to, and really, wanting to make sure that we are meeting the goals we set, ideally exceeding the goals we set, but essentially just getting better and better as we, continue to refine this program. So the areas I would point out, and I think we have a couple slides here that I'll show in terms of the visuals. One is engagement. This has been a theme in this webinar. The more students can engage, the stronger the program is going to be. The more you're able to support them, understand what their current challenges might be, how to cheerlead them, all those things. So we're really excited that we've been able to see an increase in engagement from last year to this year. So the chart on the left-hand side there shows our engagement last year. Overall active engagement was around 53%. As of February this year, overall, we're at closer to 60%. So that's exactly that sort of like iterative improvement that we're going for. It's also really critical for us to look at different slices of the data. So one example that we've been looking at is, the majority of our students in the Blueprint program are coming from our high school access program. So they knew about Bottom Line, they're familiar with the programming. This is just sort of the next level for them in terms of staying engaged. So one of the tests that we want to do is, could a student come into Blueprint without being in our access program and still, remain engaged, and could we have impact on them? So we have an example. Our newest region is in Ohio. We added some students there, and we're seeing pretty strong engagement. It's actually surpassed my expectations and predictions, which is really exciting to see. And then another slice of the data here, the bar all the way on the right-hand side is coming through a scholarship partnership that we have in Chicago. And that's been really exciting to see, is there an opportunity for us to partner with more scholarship organizations and really think about, the carrot being the scholarship and then the support being the Blueprint program that can provide more of that wraparound support. And then next slide, please. This is just another example of how we're trying to iterate over time and improve on our own results. So our goal is that, within a given year, our opt-out rate is less than 10%. To us, that's a really important metric to make sure that students are finding value. We're finding the right cadence, we're finding the right messengers, all those things that we've been talking about today. So we're very pleased that this year so far, we're right around 4% as an organization with our opt-out rates, and ideally keeping those as low as possible. Grace, I'll kick it to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to add. I think that's all great. That's really exciting, Sarah. What I would add is, like, for us, the ultimate measure is like, are our students enrolling, persisting, and graduating in college? And because this isn't a pilot for us, right? This is the way that we deliver programming to all of our, 18,000 plus students this year. We can look at our impact report, our impact outcomes, and say, like, hey, actually, yes, our students, kind of regardless of whether they've been with us for a long time and they've been receiving this messaging for years, or whether they just joined the program when they started college through a partner, or whether they're highly engaged or they're not highly engaged, we see that impact for students, which is really exciting. I think two things I would add in terms of, like, practical, how do we make sure that content is really driving that success and driving students to the near peer mentors, who we think are such an incredible part of why our students are as successful as they are. Really practically, like, one is making sure that there's a really standard definition within the organization for what high quality proactive messaging looks like. In our organization, we've made the decision to have that, like, one gatekeeper. But even before that, making sure that, we had sort of our data and evaluation team, some of whom are here, thank you, helped us sort of do a lit review and understand, we understand nudging alone isn't going to do it. But when messages are have simple steps, or are peer normed, or nudge a student towards a particular action, or weigh the kind of cost benefit, like, sort of what does the literature help us understand in terms of those best practices? What do our students help us understand in terms of those best practices? And then making sure that every single message we send out, it doesn't necessarily have to check every single one of those boxes, but, like, when you zoom back, the collective whole is kind of checking all of those boxes from a quality standpoint. And then last but not least, I would say one cool piece of what we can get back out of the mainstay system is engagement data for every single text campaign that goes out. So making sure as a team that you sit down after every single campaign goes out, or, before it's time to revise those messages for next time. You're probably going to send a message about registering for classes, like, every time of, every fall, right? At the end of every fall, looking ahead to the spring, look at last year's engagement. How did that message perform from an engagement standpoint? What tweaks might we want to make, looking at that rubric and saying, are there any of these levers that we're not taking advantage of that might help this campaign be more effective in engaging students? And also recognizing that not every message needs to engage, students at a super high level, but picking those ones that really matter, and then using that data to make sure that that message is as effective as it can possibly be.
Excellent. So as we get ready to move into Q&A, we've got one more question to explore briefly. So on the next slide, can you tell us a little bit about how you're training your staff and training the AI to support your students?
I'm good. How about you?
I was just off of mute, so I am happy to kind of stay off of mute and answer this one first. So as I mentioned before, our coaches are the ones who respond to students, and our curriculum is set up to try to drive that engagement. And so it's really important that coaches be trained and are ready to respond and answer that flood of responses that are likely to come out each time a proactive message is sent out. So one of the practices that I think really makes a difference is that in anticipation, like together, a coach and their full-time staff supervisor will look at next week's message that's scheduled to go out from that coach, right? And they will look at it together and anticipate what are the likely common responses that students are going to have. We're going to have some kids that are like, yep, I'm all set. We're going to have some kids that are confused. We're going to have some kids that are off on a tangent. What are the resources that are most likely that a student would need in this situation, even like what are some common responses? Not that the sort of response is always going to be canned back from the coach, but you can imagine a coach who's receiving hundreds of messages coming in, they're going to process through those. It's going to be really efficient for them to have some of those kind of common answers and have that quality control as well, kind of have planned that out with their supervisor and really be ready to think that and be able to kind of handle that high volume. The other thing I mentioned earlier is that we sort of consider every incoming message, even if it's a thumbs up from a kid, to be sort of like a fish on the hook. And I guess that's kind of a weird metaphor, but I'll run with it for now. So every single response is an opportunity for a coach to probe. So if the student says like, yeah, like thumbs up, the coach is trained to say like, oh, that's so great. I'm so glad you're feeling good about that. Congratulations for getting it done. How are you doing with this other thing, right? They're sort of trained to make use of every single incoming message as an opportunity, not only to celebrate or to provide troubleshooting, but also to kind of sniff out what else might be happening, because not all of our students respond to every message. Every incoming message from a student is critical. And so that team really spends a lot of time being trained on how to do that. And then, actually reviewing those student and coach conversations and analyzing which of these were really successful, which of these were less successful, and as a team, kind of building their like repertoire and understanding as a team of like what actually what are we looking for here in terms of response, and how do we correct any kind of missed opportunities. So, hey, in this conversation, you kind of let the conversation fizzle, but if you had asked this question instead, like it might have kept that conversation going. So just really taking seriously any message that comes in from students and making sure that coaches are really, really well trained to do that, whether it's the kind of proactive content or whether it's responsively.
Thanks, Grace. I can focus on the bot response here. So, as I've mentioned, we really do require human intervention and human attention to ensure quality on the bot responses. So where this really comes into play is constant review. And the more that we can review and update and make changes, the better our bot will be. So our goal is to really reduce the number of misunderstandings by the bot. We also, probably a year ago now, made a design choice where we changed. I think that when it used to be when the bot had a misunderstanding, it would say like, I'm sorry, I don't understand that. And we were seeing that there was some frustration when it came to the student not being able to get the answer they needed. We changed that to now where it says, I'm going to get in touch with, or I'm going to get you in touch with an advisor, or alert an advisor to this issue, where the advisor can then jump in. So I think in those instances, it is really important to say, okay, if the bot wasn't able to answer the student, why is that? Is it the way that the student was phrasing the question? And should we really make sure we're accounting for that in terms of the matches? Or is it really like we just completely missed this? We didn't even have a response for this. It's a question we've never seen before. So for us, it's just a constant evaluation of, do we need to add more to the knowledge base? Do we need to change things? And it gets complex too, because, we're sending out some campaigns that have multiple choice response options where, if the student says, one, in response, there's a response that comes back from the bot that we want to make sure is also accurate. So that's the piece I would really focus on, is just, continuous improvement. I don't think you ever get to the point where your knowledge base is going to be perfect, and just want to make sure that you're keeping up with the content, as the world changes around you, as students ask more and more complex questions. Just wanted to make sure that you sort of level set and are constantly evaluating the quality of those responses going out.
Fantastic conversation. So I think now we are going to be transitioning to some Q&A.
That's right. And before we do that, I just want to pause to give a huge, huge thank you to Sarah and Grace and Julie for sharing all this information. And it's been wonderful to listen to this conversation that's happening in the fishbowl. And there have indeed been a lot of questions. And I want to say a huge thank you for all of your generous sharing today and always. Please, if you do have more questions, please put them in the chat box. We will be passing them along to our panelists. And right now I would like to invite Maurice McCulley, who will moderate the Q&A. We have about 20 minutes or so, and that will allow Julie to participate as a panelist and get to respond to questions. And Julie, thank you for facilitating that. All right, Maurice, I will hand over to you. Thank you.
Great. Yes, echoing Karen, thanks everyone for your candid sort of sharing of your experiences. I wouldn't be me if I didn't just sort of throw out, I love the idea of proactive and responsive, and those definitions, and how we as a field think about that when we think about responsible AI usage, and when we think about sort of the role of hybrid advising and supporting students furthest from educational opportunity. Because at the foundation, especially ways, we are focused on Black, Latino, Indigenous, and students from low-income backgrounds. So we take that equity frame to this work really intentionally, and it's always great to work with partners that highlight that and the way they approach the work. I'm going to try and do justice to questions in the chat. I'm going to also try and to the person's first name. So if I'm not putting in, please feel free to raise your hand or come off mute. While I'm going to help guide it, I want this to be beneficial to the community. I think picking up on where we left off with the thinking about just training the bot and thinking about training for our human staff. Sarah and Paula both had a joint question around, this is in response, Sarah, please, to your question, to your information about the life responses you all get from students and the care packages. But I think in the question was, as you think about those sort of responses and training staff and training the capacity of the bot around mental health, how have you all thought about what it means for your programming and your role in supporting students' mental health? And then more broadly, I think, Julie, if you're able to answer, just as you think about developing the bot's capacity around those pieces, if you do go to a bot forward model, what are some considerations you would have for people to consider?
Yeah, I can jump in. So I am glad you asked this question. It's, as we were designing a lot of the knowledge-based answers, it was top of mind for us to make sure that anything to do with, mental health, any of the sort of, issues or challenges that the student might face in the area of life, that we were very, very careful. I mean, the goal is not to create harm or cause harm. So really wanting to make sure that in many and maybe most cases, the bot is not actually able to respond appropriately. There are some keywords that we have programs where we're able to have the bot support, where, if it's something like a suicide hotline, or getting in touch with 911 if there's an emergency and things like that. It's really important to have those keywords set up where you're able to get that response right away. I think the benefit of that as well is that our advisors work pretty core office hours. And if a student is having a personal emergency on a weekend or a holiday or after hours, it is really helpful to have the bot act as a bit of a safety net of being able to figure out, like, is a student in crisis? Is there a response that gets them some immediate support? The other piece that I think is really helpful too is setting up keywords that will create an escalation internally. So we also have some keywords if there is any keyword that might indicate self-harm or student emergency, that in addition to the advisor being able to see it in the Mainstay platform, there's also, it triggers an email response as well. So like even I, as a chief program officer, will get an email saying the Mainstay flagged this student issue, and we can make sure that there's a team of people who are responding. So I do appreciate this sort of the escalation and response system that creates, and it's definitely a conversation we're having all the time about, the bot is only good for so many things, and the bot cannot have complex conversations with students, and that really is the area where you want to escalate that to the advisor. And even in our model, we are not generally licensed mental health experts as well. So even in training our advisors, we want to make sure that they have the resources to say, you don't need to go solve this problem. What we need to do is identify the problem or the issue and make sure that the student's getting support. In many cases, that's leveraging the resources on campus.
Yeah, I think Sarah did a beautiful job there of kind of explaining the organizational structure of our platform. So there are keywords that can be built in that create an auto escalation, which is that email that gives the advisor context of what's been said that's triggered that escalation. Some of our partner institutions will have those escalations go to their police departments or their counseling centers to do wellness checks. So when those words are triggering those kinds of responses, there's a pathway to get support to the student when that's available to them. And Sarah, you explained beautifully how your advisors handle it as well. I think it's also important to highlight that when a student says something that's not self-harm, but is still mental health related, you can set things up in the platform so that that's also sends sort of an advisor assist escalation or flag that says, this student is making these kinds of comments, they're thinking about dropping out, or they're feeling really frustrated. So there's ways to also support when it's not an emergency or crisis level, but it still can get to the advisor for that complex conversation that really only a human can do.
Thank you both. The next set of questions, I think, go back to theme one, when we think about organizational structure and how you think about your teams across bottom line and Let's Get Ready. So I'm going to take three and try to make them flow together, but please, Sarah and Grace, choose between them which one makes the most sense for your context. The first was around, can you give any broad thoughts on staffing? And as you think about staffing, how have you thought about expense allocation? I think this also requires some going back to when you were earlier in the work and what were some of those initial trade-offs and considerations when you think about a full-time role versus a percentage of another staff member's time. Grace, you hit on that a little bit. And the follow-up to that was also, when you think about staffing and you think about where this sits in your model, Danette was curious, how long is the planning and setup period so that when you go to implementation, you're ready? So we've talked about this a lot from a curriculum, a very intentional scope and sequence. And then the broad staffing and expense allocation was John and Vincent. So I'll pass it over to you two.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think the broad costs related to hybrid advising for us are one around the curriculum development. And because we partner with Mainstay, we have a choice about whether to develop that curriculum in-house or whether to work with Mainstay to do that, which I think is really important. So understanding if the platform that you're working with has that. We've chosen to develop that content in-house because of all the reasons that we shared, that I shared earlier. So there's that kind of curriculum development cost, and there's certainly like an upfront cost to that, like in a pilot phase to really develop that from scratch. Or Sarah, you described your kind of knowledge-based development process of both a proactive and the reactive content needs to be developed. So there's like a pretty heavy lift up front in terms of that. But then for us, the kind of maintenance of that really does end up being at our scale with the number of different differentiated curricula that are going out. It really does end up still being about one full-time staff headcount in terms of that curriculum piece. I think there's obviously like the platform costs, that are associated, and depending on how many students, kind of a per student cost. And then there's the sort of like the actual responses, right? So for Let's Get Ready, we are leveraging paid near peer coaches who work about 10 hours a week. Given the structure of our hybrid advising model, we're able to give those coaches around 1,500 students per caseload. And as you'd imagine, they're not having an individual conversation with every student, because not every student on that caseload wants an individual conversation. So they're getting that proactive content, and then they're getting a response from that coach, and that coach can support them all the way up as high touch as they need it, right? Because they've been identified sort of through the system. So for us, it's the sort of curricular startup costs, the platform costs, and then that kind of ongoing staffing of the responsiveness. I would say like planning for us took about 9 months, give or take. A lot of this iteration sort of took another 6 months, but I would just suggest like in most curriculum and model design, but especially here, is to like build small and iterate, pilot, test, try something out. I think there's so much to learn here about like how to do this well and how to refine. Like some of the things that Sarah and I have shared today are like after years of refinement. Like Let's Get Ready's been doing this for years. We've been texting students for 10 years. We've been thinking about the AI, the escalation, and some of these other things on the background just for a couple of years. And so I just think like, building in small increments and piloting, I think, is a real key to success.
I would echo a lot of that. I think a couple things that I would add. One is there were assumptions that we made, like educated guesses on setting goals, putting in the right resources, structuring the team, and we were right on a lot of things and we were wrong on a lot of things. And we're really fortunate that we have a very adaptive team that has been able to embrace an innovative mindset and really be able to roll with things. So an example I'll share is when we first started the pilot, we thought that caseloads could be about 200 to 300. We learned over time that we're actually currently at about 650 per advisor. So that was, I think, a really interesting learning for us, that we got it wrong on the first attempt. And that does help with our overall cost per student as well, because we realized we actually can scale this more broadly than we originally thought. So it's good news, but that also required our team to really be adaptive and lean into some different roles. So I think, it was probably more expensive in terms of startup costs of like, having to build a team that was willing to build the actual program and design things and really get things off the ground. And I anticipate that our cost per student will decrease as we're able to add more students into the program, because our biggest costs are staff and the tech tools we're using. So I think the more we scale and the bigger we get, ideally that cost is going to go down over time. And the real benefit is we get to work with more students and have a broader impact.
Great, thank you both. I'm going to do a little bit of moderator privilege. There's some more questions in the chat, and if we don't get to those, we'll definitely figure out a way to follow up with you all. But I love one that came from Kathy recently that I'm going to read directly. So it's Kathy's question, not mine. But when other technology has been implemented, administration and others have felt that we would need fewer advisors. Has this been the case? I've often found that technology brings better and more questions. What's the reality? I'm just going to pass that over to you all. Anyone, feel free to jump in.
I would just start by saying, like, some students need a lot and some students don't. And what we've really appreciated about hybrid advising as a structure for our programming is that it helps us to figure out It's one way to figure out who needs a lot and who doesn't. It's not the only way, because there's other risk factors. There's some students who are really quiet who actually need a lot. So, we have to have a multi-pronged approach to identifying the students who need the most support. But what it allows us to do, we're not looking to serve the most students we possibly can on the biggest caseload with the fewest advisors. Like, that's not actually our goal. Our goal is to match students' needs. And so, we have a sort of a structure that says there are some students that need a 30-to-1 caseload, and that's right for them. And that's the amount of interacting they want to do, and that's the amount of accountability they need, and the amount of support they need to navigate those milestones. Great, that's perfect for them. And there's a lot of students who just want the information and want to know that there's a near peer coach on the other end to answer their questions if they have it, or to help them navigate a tricky situation. And so this hybrid advising model really allows us to be able to just at the end of the day, offer students the level of support and information and coaching and guidance that they need. So I just I wouldn't, yes, hybrid advising allows for efficiencies that allow us to be able to put a lot of students on a caseload, but we also want to be careful and not just overly focus on efficiency, because there are students that are going to need more, and we want to be prepared for both of those scenarios. And so I just think that's an important part of it.
Yeah, I agree with that. The thing I would add is what we're constantly looking at is making sure that we don't lose our focus on results and the strong student experience. So I think, Grace, to your point, if we were putting 5,000 students on one caseload, I don't think that we would get the same results. I think it really is about finding that balance of how many students can we serve within a given caseload with our given resources and our model before we start to see a decline. And I'm personally not willing to take on any kind of risk when it comes to seeing a decrease in results for our students. I want to make sure that those always remain high. If anything, they should be getting better. We shouldn't be sacrificing on what we're seeing for our students and their outcomes. So I don't think it's an either or thing. I think that, there's a lot of really great efficiencies. We did a time study with our advisors that was really interesting. And we're finding that our advisors in our Blueprint program are really able to spend more time with their students and solving, supporting students, solving problems with students, just reaching out proactively with students, because there is a decrease in things like, the administrative task of scheduling a meeting, of answering some of these sort of low level reminder type questions. So to me, that's really where you get both the efficiency and the impact together. And that's the balance we're always trying to find.
Great. I'm going to look to Karen and ask for maybe 3 more minutes. I think I can take 2 to 3 questions and roll it into 2. So there's there's 2, I think, that are just around more operationally. Do text communications automatically get added into each student's contact or engagement note? Kim asked within the platform, I think she means Mainstay, but I know you all also have some CRM considerations that you've done. So would love for you to comment on that real quickly. And Vincent asked a great question just around your cost per student, how you thought about it in the beginning versus where you may be now. So as much information you have around that, if you could answer those 2. And then that's the 2 in 1, I'm gonna say that. And then I'll come back with the one from Laura to close this out.
I can jump in. So you can choose to be able to integrate Mainstay with whatever CRM you're using. We use Salesforce, so we do have the connection between the 2 platforms. That I think is really an important part of that seamless student experience I was talking about, where the advisor can see the messages, so we're able to pull them in from Mainstay, see them in our CRM. And they're integrated with our case notes as well. So you can see the text exchange back and forth with the student, and you can see the case notes added by the advisor. So that for us, that was a really important piece of the technology build, was to make sure that we have our systems working together. And then the other piece I would add there is we use Power BI for our reporting dashboard. And we're also able to pull in the data from both Salesforce and Mainstay to show our results within a Power BI dashboard. And then the cost per student. So what I'll share is, what I mentioned before was that, staffing and tech are really the driving cost for us. We anticipate our costs going down. Currently this year, our cost per student in Blueprint is about $600.
I would say let's get ready. We can connect Salesforce, which is our CRM, to Mainstay. We don't currently for a whole host of reasons, but you can sort of set up different campaigns to auto save information into Mainstay. So as an advisor, Sarah, you mentioned that you all have this sort of like common caseload. In our case, a coach has their own caseload. They know who those students are, that they stay the same. And so what's cool is that when a message comes in, a coach can scroll back through the old messages as sort of a record of, what conversations have happened so far. And they can use like, there's a little dashboard, and I keep saying like on the right hand side, but like if you were looking at my screen, it would be right here. Like a little dashboard with some of that saved information, which I think is just like really important for that sort of seamless piece. I would also say what's been really nice for us is being able to export a lot of the data from Mainstay into Salesforce. So to really be able to like understand students' experience, students' engagement by exporting all of that engagement data really drives our team's decision-making, around approach, around text, around caseload size. We can make a lot of sort of like in cycle decisions by like visualizing and really looking at and understanding that data and understanding the relationship between, for example, engagement and milestone completion and some of those like really important interim impacts. I would say our cost per student comes in a couple $100 less than what Sarah described. In part, I think because we are, leveraging paid near peer coaches as our sort of amazing advisor workforce. And also we are not in the pilot phase for hybrid advising anymore. We're sort of in the, we've been doing this for a little while. This is our kind of our steady state. And so I think, we sort of see that, that number stabilizing.
Great, thank you both. A couple of things we didn't get to that I just want to raise up. There was questions around metrics of success. We did have a webinar on data. Highly recommend you all go back and listen to that. Organizations gave deep dives into how they use surveys, nudges, campaigns, how they connect it to KPIs that they are tracking in their core models as well. So I think that's very helpful information there. And if we missed anything else, please feel free to, you can always ping the shift team or myself, and we can get you to the right organization, the right person, or try to answer it ourselves. Laura asked a really good question that I'm just going to sort of like put out there and then pass back to Karen. But for all of us to think about, even though we get a lot of pushback when we talk about human in the loop and AI, and what are some tips you have when you get that pushback? Especially when they think a sophisticated bot means that AI is handling everything and there shouldn't need to be significant needs for human input or intervention. I would ask any of the three of you, if you have a response to that, if you could just put it in the chat while Karen closes us out. But I also think that's great food for thought as we think about the emerging world of AI and tech-enabled solutions and how we best support our students. So thanks again for all the great information. I'll pass it back to you, Karen.
Super. Thank you so much. I was just putting on my emoji to say thank you and to celebrate this great webinar. Fantastic content. Thank you so much, Julie and Sarah and Grace, for sharing all of your knowledge and expertise, and Maurice for moderating us there at the end for the Q&A. I think we could keep going for a long time, which I think speaks to the interest in this content. I will say I would love to invite you right now. Please type in the chat, what is your biggest aha that you learned today? I think that would feel really good for our panelists to learn more about some of the things that you gleaned from their sharing. And we will also be sending you a brief survey. We would love to hear from you in the spirit of continuous improvement, how we can improve, but also hear about your reflections, and we will pass those along as well to the speakers so that they can benefit from them. And our contact information is here as well. If you have any questions about any of the content, please don't hesitate to reach out. We would love to hear from you. Just one quick reminder as we all, I'm sure, log off and go to other meetings. Our final webinar in this series will be April 24th. We'll be talking about building on our learning and partnerships for scale. And we are inviting 3 speakers and panelists from different contexts. One from Texas, giving us the state context, college advising core with the college access organization context, and then Georgia State University, looking at a higher ed institution. We're also planning a little additional content that is still not yet announced on this slide, but we're really hoping that we can delight you with something else that we're planning for the closeout of this series. Thank you so much for joining us. I will just add one more reminder that we will have a playbook that's forthcoming in the next month or so. So please keep your eyes out. This co-op community has produced that together. We've co-authored it. It's in its final stages, and it should be ready by the end of April, early May. So and for circulation. So please keep your eyes out on that and stay in touch. And we hope you join us for the last one in April. Thank you, everybody.